Welcome to the Manitowish Waters Historical Society screencast Threads of History. Our current series, History and Evolution of the Manitowish Chain, will continue with Episode 4, Manitowish Chain Fur Trade. The image on the left illustrates the first phase of the fur trade, that of Native Americans who operated here for centuries. The middle image shows pioneer fur traders who followed the Native American classic fur trade traditions. And finally, to the right, Depression era and post-World War II Manitowish Chain families that continued the great legacy of trapping. The classic fur trade along the shores of Lake Superior were first operated by the French until the end of the French-Indian War in 1763. The British then followed until the end of the War of 1812 in 1816. Then the United States of America finally took control of its fledgling nation, and from 1817 to the collapse of the fur trade in 1847, the United States operated the classic fur trade with large markets in Europe to purchase these goods. Fur trade artifacts from archaeological surveys look very different than they do from prehistoric communities. Crosses, snare wires, gun flints, hooks, and axe heads are what typically are discovered at these sites. Importantly, fur trade artifacts have been discovered right in Lac Du Flambeau, in the famous dugout canoe that we discussed in the last episode. Shovels, axes, pan traps, and adzes all are part of the collection that were found that this dugout canoe cached next to the shores of Strawberry Island. The Ojibwa initially traded among rival First Nations like the Fox and the Dakota Sioux, but later they gained control of the region and trapped furs themselves. During this time, either the French, the British, or the Americans merely parlayed trade goods from the native communities for furs. Exchanges between fur traders and the Ojibwa dominated the Manitowish chain from 1700 to 1847. Supplied through the Great Lakes, voyageurs continued to move both trade goods in and furs out to Europe. Lake Superior communities, where two worlds meet, would facilitate both economic and cultural exchanges. The Lake Superior communities near the Flambeau Trail would access the La Pointe Post on Madeline Island. During the 18th century, native communities from areas like Lac Du Flambeau and the Manitowish Chain would travel from the interior to the basin of Lake Superior for trade. As quoted, with 15 of his men came out of the interior along the Lac Du Flambeau portage trail to the mouth of the Montreal River and the shores of the lake for the purpose of trading, each carrying a pack of beaver or other furs. The yellow arrow depicts where the fur trade post was at Little Girl's Point, and this image shows an earlier time where interior communities moved more toward the lakes. In about 1790, interior fur trade posts started to appear and were established to give traders greater access to Ojibwa trappers. As you can see from the yellow line going from La Pointe to the fur trade post in Lac Du Flambeau, this opens up a whole new opportunity of trading and new traders that were existing and sometimes competing in Lac Du Flambeau itself. Malhiot, one of the first traders of the Northwest Post, in 1804 documented his travel well. I started this morning from Lake Superior with 7 of my men to proceed at once to Lac Du Flambeau. Beneath this is a list of things that he carried on the very challenging Flambeau Trail so he could parlay for furs with the Ojibwa in the Flambeau and surrounding Ojibwa bands. Manitowish Waters Ojibwa communities are marked in red. The blue arrows illustrate specific Ojibwa villages that existed in the region. And finally, the yellow arrow points to the all-important fur trade post that Malhiot occupied. The George Brown Museum in Lac Du Flambeau has a fantastic display of a fur trade post that would be typical of Malhiot's Northwest post. You can see the exterior on the left, and on the right, through the glass pane, all the trade artifacts that were delivered to native communities in exchange for the prized furs. Victor Malhiot, the fur trader at Lac Du Flambeau, explains how plues, or tan beaver skins, were used as a system of currency. Bought furs to the value of 24 plues, most of them beaver skins. This is how an exchange would take place. Legend has it that if an Ojibwa wanted to buy a rifle or a musket, they would have to have a stack of beaver plues as high as the prized weapon. Gunflints, iron, axes were trade goods that were all in demand. Voyageurs moved to the interior from the Great Lakes and continued to provide transport to the interior regions, both fur trade items to the posts and then packing out the furs. Ojibwa seasonal villages were one of the targeted areas for the voyageurs and the traders, as they would move around and exchange their trade goods for whatever furs or food that may have been acquired. Malhiot describes trading at a remote village. He gets from them 10 or 11 sacks of wild rice, for which he gives his keg, then he leaves. This practice, as described, was intended to collect storable food for winter that the Ojibwa had harvested for their own needs. By taking that food, traders can make the Ojibwa stay in the region near the trading post to trap furs for them, as they then will spend their winter season in part trapping furs to trade for the wild rice they had just given up in this exchange. This may seem as a nefarious exchange, but it was part of the economic model utilized in this case by Malhiot, a French fur trader operating under a British license. The classic fur trade, driven by large European markets, collapsed by about 1847. At that point, there was a shift to pioneer trappers taking the lead in trapping within the areas on the Manitowish Chain. So as you look at the left, you see an image of Native Americans harpooning beaver, and beneath that is an actual harpoon pulled from the Manitowish Chain made of iron. To the right, there's an image of Peter Vance, well-known early resident of the Manitowish Chain, and he is quoted as saying, "We killed as many as 100 wildcats in a single winter, many times with only a club." As early pioneers, timber cruisers, and loggers started to populate the Northwoods. Kate and Dan Devine settled on the Manitowish Chain just before 1880, and research indicates that they were the first residents of the Manitowish Chain. Dan opened up a trading post on the location which became Kerner's or Buck's Resort on Spider Lake. Here he traded furs with the Indians. Kate Scott, Dan Devine's wife, was a Lac Du Flambeau Ojibwa. They raised a large family in Manitowish Waters, a total of 9 children. You can see the picture below of Chickasaw Point, where that first trading post was. Today, the Highway 51 bridge between Manitowish and Spider Lake would cross through that historic image. Dan Devine Sr. traded often and had a hilarious trading calamity in the 1880s. Devine had picked a great number of cranberries and was looking to make a profitable exchange. In those days, the closest train depot was Fifield, Wisconsin. So he took the long trip, filling his dugout canoe with these cranberries. Moving down the South Fork of the Flambeau River, almost in sight of Fifield and his profits, he got caught up in the fast water and tipped his boat. Imagine the scene, if you would. Cranberries, which we at Manitowish Water know float very well, would put color in the river and then quickly disperse, leaving him and all of his hopes for making money on that day. He had to pack up and head back upstream with nothing to show for all of his efforts. If you take a look at the topographical map below, I have no evidence to support this, but I'd like to think Devine Rapids, as marked by the yellow arrow on the topographical map, is the site and the namesake for this calamity and cranberry mishap. You can see it fits the bill because it's close to Fifield, Wisconsin. In 1895, another pioneer emerged as a key trapper. Fay Buck was featured in Forest and Stream magazine as an expert trapper of the Northwoods. A total of 4 articles will be written by Chicago author E.H. Huff, noted dime novelist. Buck was identified by fur buyers as one of the most prolific late 19th century trappers in the entire Northwoods. In his promotional materials for the Divide Resort, he talked about a 75-mile trapping circuit that he would run. And again, this was all documented in the articles, How Fur is Caught. Today, trapping and furs are offensive to some because of modern sensibilities and the treatment of animals. Honestly, though, the history of the Northwoods is surrounded by trappers, men and women who had to work hard and earn a living in a very difficult environment. You still could be impressed when you take a look below and you think about Fayette Buck on his 5 to 7 day, 75-mile circuit in the middle of winter. Many a night we would be obliged to dig a hole in the snow with our snowshoes, build a fire, and with a few hemlock boughs and a blanket, camp for the night and in 4 feet of snow. The pioneers who followed the trapping traditions from the classic fur trade were tough and determined residents of the Manitowish Chain. Among the most celebrated pioneer families along the Manitowish Chain are the Laportes and the Sleights. Trapping was part of their heritage and the way they made a living. To the left, George Laporte is showing off a fine catch of beaver during the Great Depression, which made a difference in the ability of him to support his family. To the right, Dick Sleight Jr., with a lot of beaver rounds or beaver plues as traditionally prepared, were all displayed for those to witness his prowess in the woods as a guide, a trapper, and a resort operator. These men and their families continued trapping traditions for over 100 years after the classic fur trade collapsed in 1847. Importantly, we witness the rise of the classic fur trade led by the French, the British, and ultimately the Americans. We should better understand the role of First Nations, in particular the Ojibwa, in capturing and preparing the furs that were exchanged with these nations. And finally, after the fur trade collapsed, a strong tradition of fur trade and running fur trade posts continued along the Manitowish Chain by the Devines, the Bucks, the Laportes, and the Sleights. We hope you enjoyed this episode on Threads of History. To connect with the Manitowish Waters Historical Society, you can join our team or merely get a free copy of our newsletter. And finally, we encourage you to go visit our website. All those specific links are on the screen for you to access.